I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 12.5 as we take a look at the Harding and Coolidge policies, both from an economic and foreign policy front. So some of the key objectives we're looking at here in 12.5, we'll be analyzing how the policies of Presidents Harding and Coolidge encouraged economic growth and prosperity during the 1920s. We'll look at some of the political scandals, including the Teapot Dome scandal, in particular on the Harding presidency. We'll explain the role the United States played in the world and around the world during the 1920s. Now, we looked a little bit previously at the rationale that the 1920 election was unique in a couple different ways, one of which, of course, is the idea that women were voting for the very first time as per the constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920, gave women the right to vote for the first time. Also, too, we're dealing with the aftermath of World War I, the transition that's involved with going from a wartime to a peacetime economy. So as citizens prepared to vote for president, what were the issues they were considering? And again, as we go through this here, you should be thinking about what you might want to respond yourself, even before I take you through some of the responses that I have listed out. And kind of the part of the exercise is a thought process for you, kind of thinking through each of the responses. To support Wilson's League of Nations and active foreign policy, which Democrats advocated for, versus Republicans who had an isolationist approach. So if you've looked at previous presidential elections, you usually look at the different characteristics, traits, platform, or list of issues that a candidate would be running on. In the case of Republicans, including Harding and his vice presidential running mate Coolidge, they were running on an isolationist approach, and they wanted to transition the economy from a wartime to a peacetime economy. Two had a Republican Warren G. Harding campaign for the presidency in 1920. Well, in direct contrast to what you might have seen in more recent years in presidential elections, big, powerful speeches by President Obama when he ran 2 times for the presidency himself in 2008 and 2012. And we saw President Trump in 2016 and again in 2020 give huge presidential speeches across the country. Warren G. Harding was kind of a little bit more of a laid-back candidate. He called for a return to normalcy, which advocated a rejection of the Democratic platform. He campaigned very moderately throughout the country, not necessarily making city-by-city stops. Of course, obviously, during the 1920s, transportation was a little bit different than what we have today, obviously less advanced. Harding wanted to put America first, and we see this kind of a theme that reoccurred in the Trump campaign during both his runs for the presidency. He wanted to obviously help us transition into a peacetime economy. He rejected the League of Nations. He wanted a conservative economic approach, one that's been tried and true for Republican candidates throughout history, supporting big businesses and a laissez-faire or hands-off approach to the economy. When you think about ultimately Harding's victory in 1920, ultimately he won the presidency because elections, they kind of run in cycles. What we mean by this is that during a period of time in history, a certain economic philosophy or approach to the presidency might necessarily be looked at as a positive approach. So they kind of go in cycles, and after 8 or 12 or 16 years, whatever it might be, of one political party controlling the presidency or even Congress, they begin to, as a country, would begin to look towards other political philosophies that you potentially might see the country go to. So after 8 years of Wilson's Democratic activist policies, the nations embraced the laissez-faire approach. And when we think about elections that go in cycles, think about some elections throughout history that have run in cycles. So in 1932, we'll be looking at these elections as we move forward throughout the school year. Democrats and Franklin Roosevelt, they replaced 12 years of Republican leadership. In 1952, Republicans and Eisenhower replaced 20 years of Democratic leadership. Bill Clinton, a Democrat, replaced 12 years of Reagan and Bush. In 2008, when President Obama took over, it was after Republicans had controlled the presidency for 20 out of 28 years. Question 5, what is the name of the group of advisors that a president appoints to help them govern? What are some of the positions that are filled through these appointments? So I'll give you a moment to think about that and also get down anything you need to from the previous questions. All right, so as you look at number 5, the group of advisors a president appoints to help them govern is a cabinet. Amongst the different positions that are part of the cabinet, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, the Attorney General. These are the core 4 positions that work underneath a president. The very first cabinet was under President Washington, where you had Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of Defense, and the very first one was Henry Knox. Hence, we have Fort Knox still within society today. Alexander Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury and the very first Attorney General. Probably the most difficult of the core 4 here to come up with would be Edmund Randolph from Virginia. Six, why are a president's choice of advisors so important? So you think about a president, obviously they have a certain skill set and certain experiences, but they're not experts in all areas. So it's important for them to have a strong team of advisors to help them govern. Today, it's even a more expansive cabinet with about 15 cabinet positions today. Some of the more recently created cabinet posts today include the Department of Homeland Security. The Environmental Protection Agency became a cabinet-level position a couple decades back. The Secretary of Energy during the Carter administration in the 1970s was appointed. And when you look at one of the more important ones, it's the Secretary of the Treasury, and that's Andrew Mellon. And we'll look at his philosophy as the Secretary of Treasury under Harding, as well as Coolidge and Hoover. So he was appointed Secretary of the Treasury by Harding, serving from 1921 to 1932. And usually a good sign that you're a strong secretary is if you can survive more than one presidential administration. That means that multiple presidents have felt that you were the best person for that position. He had a very conservative, pro-growth, pro-business, an advocate of the free market system and laissez-faire. He wanted tax cuts and very little government regulation. Mellon's supply-side economic philosophy has remained the core of the Republican Party and its economic policies ever since. We have a couple visuals here. So the Republican economic philosophy puts forth the idea that over the course of time, wealth will trickle down to all members of society if you cut taxes. And as a result of cutting taxes, the belief would be once taxes are cut, then big business owners could have more money in their pockets, and then they'll hire more workers. If they hire more workers, then obviously that'll be a situation where people who might have been unemployed can now have a job. If they have a job, then obviously they'll be able to purchase more goods, and obviously then everything will kind of trickle down from the wealthiest members of society down to the lower and middle class. Another aspect of the Republican core philosophy is laissez-faire economics, or hands-off. So entrepreneurs or your big business owners should determine what products are produced. Competition without intervention from the government determines the price of products, or supply and demand. Competition, too, determines which industries succeed and which ones will fail. And society prospers if the economy is left in the hands of those who can compete. So this is kind of a competitive economic philosophy, almost like a social Darwinism, like survival of the fittest in terms of the strongest business owners will be the ones who are most successful economically within society. Okay, 8, how did President Harding's protective tariff impact the world economy? First of all, you should think about what a tariff is. And a tariff, of course, is a tax on goods coming in from a foreign country. And when you think about how a protective tariff would work, so your basic idea, the purpose of a tariff is to encourage people to purchase goods manufactured in the United States or American-made products. Unfortunately, it created a tariff war and discouraged trade, hurting the world economy. As the United States placed tariffs on goods coming in from, let's say, Europe, Western European countries in particular began placing tariffs on American-made goods, and we were not selling as much to foreign countries as we were previously. Okay, 9, who was Herbert Hoover? He was the Secretary of Commerce, appointed by Harding. He helped to get business leaders and labor union workers to cooperate. His work helped to transition us back from a wartime to a peacetime economy. And because he had a great deal of responsibility in the period of time after World War I, he gained a lot of respect in the country, and this kind of gave him a springboard later on to run for the presidency himself. 10, how did Harding's loyalty to friends in the Ohio gang hurt his administration? Often when you run for the presidency, there are a lot of people behind the scenes that help you to get elected, people who work on your campaign, give you contributions or money. And he was from Ohio, Harding was. And as a result, he had a lot of friends back in Ohio, and they nicknamed a lot of his cronies or friends who he appointed to positions of power in the government, the Ohio gang. So Harding was too trusting of his loyal supporters from his home state of Ohio and chose friends over more qualified candidates for cabinet positions. Many Ohio gang members were incompetent, corrupt, and put making money over the best interest of the country. You should have looked at some of the illegal Ohio gang actions already if you've done some of the reading in the book. Let's take a look here. First of all, you can see the image. That's his cabinet. So the Veterans Bureau Chief, Charles Forbes, he practiced graft, authorizing his department to grossly overpay at 24 times the going rate, for example, for a 100-year supply of floor cleaner. So graft's a way in which you overpay a friend, in this case here for floor cleaner, and then they give you a kickback later on, money on the side for doing so. It's kind of an indirect way of embezzling money from the government. Attorney General Harry Daugherty accepted money from criminals so that he would not prosecute them. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, got involved in the biggest scandal of all over illegal sale of oil reserves to private companies. So number 12 deals with the scandal, remembered as the Teapot Dome scandal. So what Albert Fall did is he transferred oil reserves in the hills of California, as well as the city of Teapot Dome, Wyoming, from the Navy Department to the Department of Interior. And the way in which we had oil reserves ever since World War I, we had come up with the idea, even prior to World War I in the early 1900s. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, even after the Spanish-American War and leading up to the World War I, Roosevelt felt that we should always have oil on hand just in case we got into a crisis or an emergency. And the Navy Department was in charge of these oil reserves. So what Albert Fall did is he took the oil reserves and took control of them and took the oil that was designated for the Navy in times of emergency and sold off the rights to the oil to private business people or private oil companies. And he took a big bribe in order to do so. Eventually, the scandal broke in 1924. The Senate investigated the incident. The reserves were returned to the Navy. And Albert Fall served 1 year in prison for these illegal activities that became known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Here's a cover of a book, Teapot Dome scandal. You can see there the shape of the teapot there and kind of the steam blowing out, and how big oil brought the Harding White House in almost to an end. Harding, we're going to see, passes away before he's really prosecuted for any of his doings in the Teapot Dome scandal. So 13 is kind of your own opinion. Would you held Harding accountable for the wrongdoings of his advisors, not just Albert Fall, but all the other ones we had mentioned previously? There's two ways to kind of look at it. Yes, a president is responsible for the actions of the government that they lead. Therefore, Harding should have had better awareness of what was going on around him. Or you could argue, no, these were greedy individuals who attempted to exploit their positions of power for profit, and a president cannot be held accountable for the actions of all members of his government or her government. A president cannot micromanage every individual working underneath them. Unfortunately for Harding, he's going to die in 1923 unexpectedly. Some believe that Harding was fearing the oncoming ramifications of the scandal and the negativity surrounding him. He actually went on a cross-country speaking tour to reconnect with Americans. By August of 1923, he was exhausted from the journey across the country. And through the stress, Harding had complications from a heart attack and died of natural causes. And because the scandal was not yet fully known, when he died, he got the full honors of any other president. The nation was not yet aware of the travesty of the scandals. Americans were deeply saddened by Harding's untimely death. He became the second president since 1901 in this period of time of about 22 years to die unexpectedly in the office of the presidency, with William McKinley dying in 1901 by an assassin's bullet. And shortly after his death, many of the scandals of his presidency became better known, and his legacy, Harding's legacy, was forever tarnished by the scandal, and Harding rates in the bottom 5 of presidents of all time. Of course, the vice president of the United States will become president after his death, and this is Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge, of course, the former governor of Massachusetts, was sworn in by his father on the family Bible in their small farmhouse in Vermont. You can see the painting of which is below there. This kind of was very endearing to the American public when they heard of the story. Coolidge immediately did like a 180, eliminating any leftover corrupt elements in the government, had a very calm, quiet presence about him. He was very much admired by Americans who admired his steady hand, and overwhelmingly elected Coolidge on his own in 1924. Describe Calvin Coolidge's personality. Why is this unusual for a president? What was his nickname? He was quiet, honest, frugal, said very little, did not like the spotlight. And of course, this is very unusual for a president, as most presidents are very outgoing, very gregarious, very much liking shaking hands, kissing babies, giving speeches. They love the limelight, the press. His nickname was Silent Cal. And the little story here, I have a little note there for you. I'll tell the story. You don't necessarily have to write the story down. Calvin Coolidge was once challenged to a bet at a dinner party. The person knew Coolidge's story of being very quiet and reserved. And the person seated next to Coolidge said, "I bet you $5 that I can get you to say at least 3 words tonight." Calvin Coolidge replied to the person, after shaking his head yes, that he would take the bet. "You lose." So he said 2 words, didn't say any other words the rest of the night, and got $5 at the end of the night for not saying 3 words. 19, explain Coolidge's economic philosophy, and he's a Republican, of course, so if you think of it in the context of traditional Republicans, he shared the conservative philosophy of his Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary Mellon, who he reappointed to the position. He believed the creation of wealth by big businesses benefited all citizens. 20, list economic priorities of the Coolidge administration. Cut taxes, cut federal spending, reduce the national debt. What were the results of some of Coolidge's economic policies? For almost 6 years, the economy soared. Industrial profits were high. Stock market saw spectacular growth. Cities expanded. Americans had a very positive feeling about the economy. So during the 6 years of Coolidge's presidency, he had one of the more successful economic periods of time in the history of our country. In fact, he's probably an underrated president, in the sense that We could not have done much better economically during his time in office. In fact, he could have run for re-election again in 1928. He chose not to do so. However, despite a strong economy during most of the 1920s, there were underlying problems that were under the surface during the 1920s, and maybe you can think of some of those problems before I share out some responses. Labor unions, they were demanding higher wages and better conditions. We had things like segregation and prejudice with Jim Crow laws and lynchings in the South. Mexican Americans were paid shockingly low wages, and farmers continued to struggle. 23, how are international relations changing during the 1920s? The United States was truly now a world power and found it very challenging to retreat from the world stage. After World War I, empires crumbled, monarchies fell in Germany and Russia. Communism became a very big source of concern during this period of time as well, as we saw the Communist Revolution in Russia take place in 1917. 24, how did the Kellogg-Briand Pact impact international relations? Well, many countries around the world were still reflecting back negatively on the horrors of World War I. United States Secretary of State Frank Kellogg and the French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand authored a treaty in which they outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. 62 nations in total signed the treaty, but the big weakness with the treaty is even though they outlawed war on paper, they had no way of physically stopping a war from breaking out. One lingering problem from World War I were the high reparation payments that the Germans owed the West European countries, Great Britain and France. And a member of the United States government, Charles Dawes, came up with a plan to help solve some of these issues. We have a little visual here that might help you better understand it. Under this plan, the European economy obviously is ravished after World War I. Germany owed $33 billion in war reparations to Great Britain and France, and the French and British owed the United States billions in war debt. So this plan called for the United States to loan money to Germany in the form of billions of dollars. Then in return, Germany could pay their reparation payments to the British and the French, and then they could pay us back the war debt they owed. So it might seem like kind of a silly plan, but what it did is it got money moving in the economy and helped to stimulate the world economy. If you look at the visual there, on paper, the United States would send $2.5 billion to Germany. The Germans would send $2 billion to the Allies. They would send $2.6 back to us, and it would kind of continue like that over the course of about a 6-year period of time. And lastly, the lesson reflection question: do you think the United States should always play an active role in world affairs? Why or why not? That's your own opinion. I'll share out 2 opinions in a moment, but kind of formulate your own first. And then just write down your opinion as to what you think the United States should do in regard to being active in world affairs. You could argue yes, as an economic and military superpower, the United States has almost like an obligation to lead on major issues. Others might state no, the United States has their own serious problems that need to be addressed on the home front. Poverty, jobless rates, things like that should be our top priority. Also, being too active in foreign affairs could lead the United States to getting dragged into conflicts we have no interest in fighting. All right, so take a moment or two to make sure you reflect it out for the lesson reflection, as we like to do at the end of each lesson. Hope you enjoyed our discussion on this particular series of topics. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.